The gun hit the floor before anyone in the Silver Spur Saloon even registered that it had been drawn. Gertrude Alden stood at the center of the room, her hand still raised, her fingers steady as a surgeon's, her dark eyes fixed on the man who had just threatened to expose everything she had traveled 800 miles to bury. The saloon had been loud when she walked in, piano clattering, boots stomping, men laughing with the reckless abandon of people who believed tomorrow would never collect on tonight's debts. Now it was so silent that the creak of the ceiling fan above the bar sounded like a slow heartbeat counting down to something irreversible. She had not fired the gun. She had not needed to. She had simply spoken 4 words in that low, even voice of hers, that voice that carried the particular weight of someone who had already survived the worst thing imaginable. And the man who called himself Judge Harlan Cree had gone pale as winter milk and dropped his weapon like it had turned to hot iron in his grip. Every man in that saloon stared at her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the particular way that women forged by hardship and intelligence become beautiful, a sharpness to her cheekbones, a directness in her gaze that made you feel simultaneously seen and humbled. They stared because she had walked into the most dangerous room in Redemption, Texas, alone, in the late summer of 1882, wearing a traveling dress the color of storm clouds, and she had dismantled a threat that had 3 armed men backing it up, using nothing but 4 quiet words and the absolute, unshakable certainty in her posture that she was the most dangerous person in the room. Warren Whitfield was leaning against the far end of the bar when she walked in. He had been nursing the same glass of rye whiskey for the better part of an hour, which was something of a personal record for him in recent months, and he had been watching the door with the kind of attention that a man develops when he has learned, the hard way, that trouble rarely knocks before it enters. He saw her come in and felt something shift in the room before he fully understood why. She had spoken softly. That was the thing. Every man in that saloon, cowboys who had ridden through Apache territory, gamblers who had cheated death at card tables from El Paso to Kansas City, a sheriff who had seen things that kept lesser men awake for years, had gone completely, utterly silent. Not because she had shouted or threatened or fired into the ceiling the way some women did when they needed to command a room. She had simply spoken, and the room had recognized something in her voice, the way animals recognize the stillness before a storm. Warren set down his glass very carefully. He had no way of knowing, standing there in the golden lamplight of the Silver Spur on that August evening, that Gertrude Alden had just walked into the center of his life and was never going to leave. But we should go back to the beginning, because the story of how a woman arrives speaking softly and leaves every man in a saloon completely silent is not a story that begins the day she walks through the door. It begins weeks earlier, in a different kind of silence, the silence of a woman making a decision that will change everything. 3 weeks before that night in the Silver Spur, Gertrude Alden had been sitting in a law office in Austin, Texas, listening to a man with a tidy mustache and damp hands explain to her, in the patient tone of someone addressing a person of limited understanding, that there was nothing more to be done. The law office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and outside the window the city moved in its ordinary way, indifferent to the particular catastrophe unfolding in the chair across from the lawyer's desk. Gertrude had her hands folded in her lap. She had been sitting in that chair for 20 minutes and she had not cried, which she could tell made the lawyer slightly uncomfortable. People expected women to cry in his office. It was one of the tools by which he measured the severity of what he had just told them. What he had just told Gertrude Alden was this: the land deed to the property her father had spent 30 years building in the hill country west of Austin, 1,200 acres of grazing land, a farmhouse, a creek that never ran dry even in drought years, a small orchard of peach trees her mother had planted before she died, was fraudulent. Had been, in fact, fraudulent for the better part of 4 years. Had been made so by a man named Harlan Cree, who had, at some point in the winter of 1878, forged a second deed under a false name and registered it in a county office in Redemption, where the county clerk was his second cousin and the records were, to put it charitably, flexible. Her father had died in the spring, not knowing, or perhaps knowing, which might have been part of why he went so quickly once he took sick. Gertrude had not decided which possibility was worse. The lawyer folded his hands and told her that the courts in Austin were unlikely to touch a property dispute rooted in Redemption County, where Harlan Cree was, to all intents and purposes, the law. He told her this with an expression of genuine sympathy that did not translate into any offer of practical assistance, and when Gertrude stood and thanked him and walked out of his office, she did so with the quiet, complete certainty that she was going to have to solve this herself. She was 26 years old. She had no husband, no brothers, no male relatives of any kind who might ride to Redemption and confront Harlan Cree on her behalf. She had a modest sum of money saved from the years she had spent teaching school in Austin, a single trunk of possessions, and a clarity of mind that she had been told, at various points in her life, was either her greatest asset or her most dangerous quality, depending on who was doing the telling. She booked a seat on the stage to Redemption the following Monday. Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1882, was a town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be when it grew up. It had the bones of permanence, a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a bank, a hotel, a barbershop, a dry goods store, a telegraph office, but also the nervous energy of a place that knew its prosperity was recent and therefore fragile. The cattle trade had brought money in, and the money had brought men, and the men had brought everything that followed men who had cash and no particular reason to be careful with it. The Silver Spur Saloon sat at the northern end of Main Street like a proprietor, surveying his holdings. It was owned by a man named Dutch Pierce, who was 300 pounds of pragmatic good humor and had, over 11 years of running the establishment, developed an instinct for the precise moment when an evening was about to turn violent, which allowed him to prevent most incidents before they became incidents. He was proud of this skill and regarded it as his primary professional qualification. Warren Whitfield had arrived in Redemption 14 months earlier, which made him a relative newcomer by the town's loose accounting of such things. He was 32 years old and had the look of a man who had been somewhere difficult and was not entirely finished processing what he had seen there. He was tall, lean through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had once been broader and had not been eating enough lately, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and green eyes that had the particular quality of paying attention to everything simultaneously, without appearing to focus on any one thing. He worked officially as a farrier and horse trader, which was legitimate work and kept him fed. He was also, less officially but more lucratively, the person that people in Redemption came to when they needed something complicated made uncomplicated, which was a role that had accrued to him gradually and somewhat against his will, based on a combination of his evident competence and the fact that he was one of the few men in town who was not currently beholden to Harlan Cree. This last quality had made his life interesting in ways he did not always appreciate. Harlan Cree was not the sheriff of Redemption. That position was held by a man named Amos Tuttle, who was perfectly adequate in a ceremonial sense and deeply inadequate in any functional one. But he was the person who made the decisions that mattered. He owned the bank, a substantial portion of the cattle operation north of town, the hotel, and the loyalty of enough armed men to make disagreement with him a project requiring careful planning. Warren had been planning for 11 months. He had not planned to become personally invested in the dismantling of Harlan Cree's operation. He had come to Redemption for reasons that had more to do with his own dark past than with any particular social conscience. Specifically, because a man he had once ridden with had wound up dead in circumstances that Cree's men had arranged, and Warren had been in the area at the time and decided to stay and find out exactly what had happened and to whom it could be attributed. What he had found over the course of those 11 months was a pattern of fraud, coercion, and land theft that went considerably beyond the death of one man, and he had begun, almost without intending to compile the kind of evidence that a federal court might find compelling. He had contacts, a federal marshal named Briggs in San Antonio who was sympathetic, a newspaper editor in Austin who was interested, a lawyer who handled federal land cases and had been looking for a case like this one for years. What he did not yet have was the specific document that would tie the fraudulent deed registry in Redemption County back to Cree directly. Without that, everything else was circumstantial. He had been waiting for the opportunity to get it. He had not expected the opportunity to walk into the Silver Spur on a Tuesday evening in August wearing a storm-colored dress. Gertrude arrived in Redemption on the afternoon stage, which deposited her, her trunk, and 4 other passengers in front of the hotel at 3:30 in the afternoon. The heat was extraordinary, the kind of heat that seems to press down from above like a physical weight, and the dust from the stage's arrival hung in the air long after the horses had been led away. She checked into the hotel under her own name, which was either courage or strategic indifference to concealment, and she spent an hour in her room reading the notes she had made in Austin. Everything she knew about the fraudulent deed, the name of the county clerk who had registered it, the approximate location of the county records office, and what she had learned from a former associate of Cree's who had approached her lawyer's office 6 months ago, with information he had subsequently become too frightened to formalize. Then she went downstairs, asked the hotel clerk where a person might find reliable information about the town's legal affairs, and received, in response, a look of such naked alarm that she understood immediately the magnitude of what she was dealing with. She ate dinner alone in the hotel dining room. The food was better than she expected. She watched the other diners and cataloged what she saw, a table of cattle buyers who were in town on legitimate business, and gave off the particular air of men who had decided not to notice things that were not their concern. A couple, clearly married, who were not speaking to each other. A young man who was trying and failing to look like he was not watching her. And at a corner table, 2 men with the particular careful stillness of people who were employed to observe and report. She finished her meal, ordered coffee, and made a point of looking directly at the 2 observing men long enough that they would understand they had been noticed. Then she went upstairs and slept for 9 hours, which was something she rarely managed in Austin. In the morning she went to the county records office. The county clerk was a thin man named Purvis Dunmore, and he was, as she had been told, Harlan Cree's second cousin, and he had the look of a man who had made a bargain with his conscience some years ago and was not finding the terms as comfortable as he had initially anticipated. He was polite to her in a superficial way that became markedly less polite when she stated her business, which she did directly and without preamble. She told him she was there to review the deed registry for her father's property. She gave the parcel description. She watched his face go through 3 distinct emotional states in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and a kind of trapped dread, before it settled into an expression of bureaucratic regret. He told her the records were not available for public review without a formal request submitted in writing, which needed to be approved, which would take 6 to 8 weeks. Gertrude thanked him pleasantly and left. She had not expected it to be simple. She had, however, needed to see his face when she named the property, and she had seen exactly what she needed to see. On her way back to the hotel, she passed the Silver Spur Saloon. The doors were open in the heat, and through them came the smell of sawdust and whiskey and the particular acoustic quality of a space built for noise. She did not go in. Not yet. She spent the next 2 days making herself quietly visible around Redemption, at the dry goods store, at the post office where she sent a letter to her lawyer in Austin, at the small cafe that operated out of a converted wagon at the south end of Main Street. She was polite to everyone she encountered. She asked questions that were too innocuous to be alarming, but that assembled, in aggregate, a fairly detailed picture of the social architecture of the town. She learned that Harlan Cree was in redemption most of the time, and that he conducted his affairs from an office above the bank. She learned that he was not a man who resorted to violence directly, but that he employed people who were comfortable with it. She learned that he had 3 men in particular who handled complications: a former lawman named Breck, a large and silent individual known only as German Carl, and a younger man named Dobbs who was regarded as the most dangerous of the 3 because he was the least predictable. She also learned about Warren Whitfield, because in a town the size of Redemption, a person asking careful questions about who could be trusted inevitably arrived at the same name from multiple directions. The woman who ran the dry goods store mentioned him in the context of a dispute he had resolved between 2 ranchers the previous spring, in which he had apparently managed to get both parties to agree to terms that were fair without anyone having to draw a weapon. The telegraph operator, who had opinions about everything and shared them freely, described him as the most complicated, straightforward man he had ever met, which was the kind of characterization that Gertrude found interesting. She had not yet spoken to him when everything changed. On the evening of her 3rd day in Redemption, Gertrude returned to her hotel room after dinner to find that her trunk had been searched. It had been done carefully enough that a less observant person might not have noticed, but she noticed, because she had packed her trunk with the specific intention of detecting exactly this kind of intrusion. The small folded paper she had placed between her personal correspondence and her spare shirtwaist was in a different position. Her father's deed, the original, legitimate one, had been moved a 1/4 inch to the left. They had read it, which meant they knew exactly who she was and why she was here. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, hands still in her lap, and thought through her options with the methodical calm that had always been her strongest quality and that people consistently underestimated because it presented, from the outside, as passivity. She was not passive. She had never been passive. She had learned from a very young age that the most effective kind of action was the kind that other people did not recognize as action until it was too late to respond to it. She was also, she acknowledged to herself, in a degree of danger that she had calculated from the beginning, but that was now concrete rather than theoretical. She needed an ally, not because she could not handle this alone. She had handled things alone before and was fully prepared to do so again, but because the specific obstacle between her and the fraudulent deed registry was not one that soft speech and clarity of mind alone could remove. She needed someone who knew where the documents were, how the county records office worked, and who had enough standing in the community to make a formal complaint stick. She had one name. The following evening, Gertrude Alden put on her storm-colored dress and walked into the Silver Spur Saloon. The place was full midweek busy, which in Redemption meant roughly 40 men at varying stages of their evening's entertainment. A piano player working through a repertoire that seemed to consist primarily of 3 songs played in different tempos, and Dutch Pierce behind the bar with the watchful ease of a man entirely at home in controlled chaos. Gertrude came through the door and moved to the bar with the specific purposeful quality that distinguished her from someone who had wandered in. She ordered a glass of water, which Dutch Pierce provided without comment, though she could see him taking note of her in the way that a good saloon keeper takes note of anything that does not fit the established pattern. She had been there for approximately 4 minutes when Harlan Cree walked in from the back. She recognized him from the description she had been given, a man in his late 40s, well dressed by the standards of the frontier, with silver at his temples and the kind of easy authority that comes from being the largest fish in a particular pond for an extended period. He had 2 men with her, Breck and the one they called German Carl. Dobbs, notably, was not present. Cree crossed the room toward her with the measured stride of someone who has decided how a conversation is going to go before it begins. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her with the expression of a man who has found something on his property that he needs to remove. He said her name. He said it as an assertion rather than a question. He told her, in terms that were technically polite and entirely threatening in their implication, that it would be in her best interest to take the morning stage back to Austin and accept the situation regarding her father's land as settled, and that she had until morning to make that decision. Gertrude looked at him for a moment. And then she said 4 words. She said them softly, so softly that the men nearest them strained slightly to hear, and in that same measured, untroubled voice that she used for everything from greeting students to correcting errors in legal documents. She said them with the particular quality of someone stating an observable fact about the weather. She said, "I have the ledger." She did not have the ledger. Not yet. But she had, in her research in Austin, learned enough about the specific nature of Cree's fraud to know that there was a secondary ledger, a record of the bribes and payments that had facilitated the false deed registrations, that Cree kept separate from the official county records, because he was not a fool, and he understood that the official records could be subpoenaed, while a private document could be destroyed. She also knew, from the terrified former associate who had approached her lawyer 6 months ago, that this ledger existed and that Cree lived in genuine fear of its discovery. She did not know where it was, but she knew it existed, and she knew that saying she had it would produce a specific reaction that would tell her something useful. What it produced was silence. Harlan Cree went absolutely still. The men around him, the ones close enough to hear, which turned out to be most of the room because it had gone quiet in that particular way that rooms go quiet when something significant is happening, went still along with him. Breck's hand moved toward his weapon. And before it could arrive, Gertrude said, in that same quiet voice, "If that hand completes its journey, a copy of the ledger is in a lawyer's office in Austin with instructions for what to do if I don't return from redemption in good health." This was also not true. There was no copy. There was no lawyer with instructions. But the bluff was constructed on a foundation of enough real information that it was entirely plausible, and the look on Harlan Cree's face confirmed that it was working. He held the silence for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice stripped of its earlier polish, "You're making a serious mistake, Miss Alden." And Gertrude said, "I don't think I am," and turned back to the bar. Cree stood there for another 3 seconds. She counted them peripherally, while keeping her face toward the bar and her posture completely relaxed, and then he turned and walked out, taking Breck and German Carl with him. The silence held for another 5 seconds after the door closed behind them. Then the piano started up again, and conversation gradually resumed, and the Silver Spur returned to its ordinary chaos, except that it wasn't quite ordinary, because 40 men had just watched a woman in a storm-colored dress face down the most powerful man in Redemption County with 4 quiet words and walk away from it standing. Warren Whitfield had watched all of it from the end of the bar. He had watched her come in. He had watched Cree approach her. He had been close enough to hear what she said both times, and he had felt, in the moment she said the word ledger, a sensation that combined surprise and recognition, and something more personal and harder to name in a way that was entirely unfamiliar to him. He had been looking for that ledger for 11 months. He waited until the room had fully returned to its ambient noise level, then picked up his untouched glass of rye and walked to where she was standing. He said, "That was either the bravest thing I have ever seen or the most reckless. I genuinely cannot determine which." Gertrude turned to look at him. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes that managed to be assessing without being unkind, and he felt himself evaluated in a way that was more thorough than was comfortable and more interesting than he had expected. She said, "It may have been both simultaneously." He extended his hand. "Warren Whitfield." She looked at his hand, then at his face, and shook it with a firm, brief grip. "Gertrude Alden, "You're the person I came here to find." There was a silence that was different in quality from the one that had preceded it, not the silence of shock, but the silence of two people recognizing something. He said, "We need to talk somewhere that isn't here." She said, "I agree. But not tonight. Tonight you should go home by your usual route and act as though nothing about this evening was significant." He stared at her. She said, "Cree is going to have people watching you within the hour, assuming he doesn't already. Tonight you're just a man who was in the saloon. In the morning, come to the hotel dining room at 7. Sit at the corner table. I'll arrive at 7:15. She picked up her glass of water, finished it, set it down, and walked out of the Silver Spur with the same purposeful ease with which she had entered. Warren stood at the bar and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was in considerable trouble in ways that had nothing to do with Harlan Cree. He took his usual route home and went to bed, and did not sleep for a long time, which was unusual for him, because he normally slept fine, and had trained himself to do so through a range of circumstances that would have kept other people awake. At 7 the following morning, he was at the corner table of the hotel dining room with coffee and eggs, and the particular alert stillness of a man who is pretending to be less focused than he is. At 7:15, Gertrude sat down across from him, and they had the first of what would become many conversations that were simultaneously practical and revelatory, in the way that conversations between two intelligent people who are at the beginning of something tend to be. She told him about her father's land. She told him about the fraudulent deed. She told him about the county clerk and what she had seen on his face when she named the property, and about the Austin lawyer who had told her there was nothing to be done, and about the former associate of Cree's who had told her about the ledger before losing his nerve. She did not tell him she had been bluffing when she said she had it. She watched to see if he would assume she had been. He said, "You don't actually have the ledger." She met his eyes. "No, but you know it exists." "I know it exists." He leaned back in his chair. "So do I. I've known it exists for 8 months. I've been trying to find it for 7. She said, "Where do you think it is?" He said, "Cree's personal safe, which is in his office above the bank." "I can't get into that office without a reason that would be accepted as legitimate, and I can't get into the safe without someone who knows the combination or who can work one." She said, "I can work a combination lock." He looked at her. She said, "I grew up on a working ranch. My father taught me everything he knew about security because he said a woman alone needed to understand how locks worked in both directions." Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You understand what you're describing is a criminal act in the current legal framework, despite the moral justification." She said, "I understand that the man who stole my father's land is also currently using it to pasture cattle, and that the courts in this county are not going to help me, and that the evidence inside that safe would expose not only the fraud on my father's land, but an entire pattern of theft affecting at least a dozen other families in this county." "Yes, I understand what I'm describing." He said, "All right." She said, "All right. I've been working toward exposing Cree for 11 months. I have a federal marshal in San Antonio who is waiting for the kind of evidence that's in that safe. If we can get it, it doesn't matter how we got it, because federal jurisdiction supersedes the county arrangement, and Cree won't have the resources to suppress it once it's in Briggs's hands." She looked at him steadily. "You've been planning this for 11 months alone." He said, "More or less." "Why?" There was a pause. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, then back at her. "A friend of mine was killed. His name was Thomas Graves. He'd been ranching outside Redemption for 4 years, and Cree wanted his land because of the water rights. Tom wouldn't sell. He died in what was reported as a riding accident, which it wasn't." He paused again. "Tom was a good man. He had a family." She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Me too." They sat with that for a moment in the particular way that two people sit with shared grief when they have only just met and do not yet have the language for it. Then she said, "Tell me about the bank's layout." Over the next 4 days, they met each morning in the hotel dining room, and each afternoon at a spot she had identified on the edge of town, where two cottonwood trees provided enough shade to make a conversation look like nothing more than a couple of people escaping the heat. They were careful about it. They varied the times. They never arrived together. Gertrude was meticulous about operational detail, in a way that Warren found simultaneously reassuring and privately delightful, because it was the quality he most relied on in himself, and he had never encountered it in such concentrated form in another person. She had, by the end of the second day, produced a sketch of the bank's floor plan based on a single visit to make a legitimate deposit, a description from the hotel proprietor who had once had cause to visit Cree's office, and information gathered from 3 separate casual conversations in the town that had yielded, in aggregate, a remarkably complete picture. He told her about his contacts, Marshall Briggs, the Austin lawyer, the newspaper editor. She told him about the former Cree associate in Austin, whose name was Elkins and who was frightened but not entirely without conscience. He said, "If we can get the ledger to Briggs with your testimony and Elkins's testimony, Cree is finished. He won't be able to buy his way out of federal fraud charges," she said. "The deed to my father's land will be restored." He said, "Yes," she said, "and the other families." He said, "Them too." There was something in the way she said the other families, a weight to it that went beyond the legal abstraction, that told him she had thought about this more than her own situation warranted, and he found himself, not for the first time in those 4 days, looking at her with a degree of attention that was not entirely professional. She noticed. She had noticed the day before, and the day before that, and she had been carefully not examining what she made of it, because she was in the middle of something that required her full concentration, and because she had learned, over the years, to be suspicious of her own instincts when they pertained to how she felt about a particular person. She had had one significant romantic history before this, which had ended badly in the specific way that romantic histories end, when one party is drawn to someone who is ultimately unwilling to accept the full reality of who that person is. The man in question had found her intelligence and capability attractive in a theoretical sense, and had gradually found them inconvenient in a practical one. The relationship had dissolved quietly, without drama, in a way that had been more painful than a dramatic ending would have been, because quiet endings leave everything unsaid. She was not going to make the same mistake twice. She was going to finish what she came here to do and go back to Austin and figure out what came next. That was the plan. The plan began to have complications on the 4th evening. They were sitting at the cottonwood spot, and it was close to sunset, the sky going through its western performance of orange and gold above the flat horizon, and they had finished reviewing the logistics for what they were calling, for the sake of having a name for it, the operation, and there was a moment of the particular quiet that falls between two people who have run out of practical things to discuss but are not yet ready to leave. He said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the plan?" She said, "That depends on the question." He said, "Why didn't you stay in Austin? You had a lawyer telling you it couldn't be done. Most people would have accepted that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father built that land from nothing. He came to Texas with $40 and a horse, and he built 1,200 acres over 30 years, and he did it honestly, which is harder than it sounds, and which I don't think people who didn't see it fully appreciate. He also raised me alone from the time I was 8 because my mother died of fever, and he raised me to believe that what you build by honest work is yours and that people who take it by dishonest means are answerable for it." She paused. "He died in the spring without knowing what had been done to him. I am not going to let it stand." Warren said, "He sounds like a good man." She said, "He was the best man I've ever known." And then, before the sentiment could settle into something too exposed, she added, "Until recently that category had limited competition, so the bar may have needed adjustment." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not the polite kind, and it changed his face in a way that she had not anticipated, and that she spent some time afterward not thinking about with the specific intensity of someone trying very hard not to think about something. He said, "I'll take what I can get," she said. "You should," and stood up and left because the alternative was staying, and she had a plan to execute. The night of the operation, as they had taken to calling it, with the slightly ironic gravity of two people who know they are doing something serious but have chosen a light word for it, as a small act of defiance against the heaviness, was a Wednesday, which Warren had identified as the night Cree reliably spent at dinner with a group of cattlemen from north of town. It was a standing arrangement. Cree never varied it. It was the one predictable window in his schedule. They had spent 2 days of careful observation confirming that on Wednesday evenings the bank was locked but not separately guarded, and that the door to the outside staircase leading to Cree's office was secured with a padlock of a type that Warren knew how to open with a piece of wire in under 2 minutes. She wore dark clothing. He wore the same. They went separately to the back of the bank at 10 minutes past 8, when the street was at its busiest, and the shadows at the back of the building were at their deepest. He had the padlock open in 90 seconds. They went up the stairs and into the office, which smelled of leather and tobacco and money in the specific way that offices belonging to men who conflate wealth with self-worth tend to smell. She went directly to the safe, which was behind a painting of a cattle drive on the north wall, exactly where the hotel proprietor had indicated, and exactly the model she had anticipated from his description. She knelt in front of it and put her ear to the dial and began to work. He stood at the window and watched the street below with the calm of a man who is afraid, but has decided not to let that be the most important thing about the current moment. She said quietly, "There is a version of this that ends badly." He said just as quietly, "Most versions of worthwhile things include that version," she said. "That's either profound or a rationalization." He said, "Probably both," and heard behind him the soft mechanical sound of a combination lock yielding. The safe contained exactly what they had hoped for. The ledger was there, a leather-bound book, about 200 pages, written in Cree's own hand, which was a remarkable piece of arrogance, but also explained why he kept it personally rather than entrusting it to anyone else. It was, in Warren's assessment as he rapidly turned the pages, the most comprehensive document of systematic county-level fraud he had ever seen. Every payment, every bribed official, every forged deed, the names of all 23 properties, he said, "This is everything." She was looking over his shoulder. Her face in the dim light from the window was very still, and he could see, in the set of her jaw, the particular controlled emotion of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is only now permitting themselves to feel how heavy it has been. He said, without thinking about it, "He's going to answer for this." She said yes, and there was something in that single word that was not about the ledger at all. He put the ledger inside his jacket. She closed the safe and turned the combination back to its original setting. They left the office exactly as they had found it, went down the stairs and replaced the padlock. They were back on the main street, separately, within 15 minutes of having left it. The following morning, Warren sent a telegram to Marshal Briggs in San Antonio. The telegram was brief, and used a prearranged code they had established months earlier and that now acquired, with the addition of the ledger, a completely different weight. He also sent letters, one to the Austin lawyer, one to the newspaper editor by that morning's post, with copies of key pages from the ledger that he had spent the previous night carefully transcribing by lamplight in his room above the stable. Gertrude sent a telegram to her lawyer in Austin. She also sent a letter to the terrified Elkins, who was the former Cree associate in Austin, telling him that the evidence was now in federal hands, and that if he wished to provide his testimony, the personal risk he had been fearing was now substantially reduced. She wrote it in the kind of direct, uncondescending language that she had found, from years of teaching school, was more effective than elaborate reassurance. Then they waited. Waiting was, in Gertrude's experience, the hardest part of any enterprise requiring patience, because waiting required you to be present in the current moment rather than the projected one, and the current moment had a way of being more complicated than you had planned for. In this case, the complication was that Harlan Cree had not yet discovered that the ledger was gone. They had been careful enough that he might not realize it immediately, but he had clearly decided, on the basis of her confrontation in the Silver Spur, that she was a threat that required active management. On the second day of waiting, German Carl appeared outside the hotel at a time that coincided precisely with her usual departure for the afternoon. He was not doing anything aggressive. He was simply there, large and patient, in a way that communicated the message clearly. She walked past him without altering her stride and spent the afternoon in the dry goods store, talking to the proprietor about nothing in particular, and sent a note to Warren by way of the hotel's young errand boy. The note said, "They are watching me more closely. I believe Cree is preparing to move before the federal response arrives. Can you accelerate the timeline?" Warren's response arrived within the hour. He had already sent a second telegram to Briggs. The marshal was planning to arrive in Redemption within 3 days, with 2 deputies. 3 days was the timeline they needed to survive. What made the 3 days complicated was Dobbs. Dobbs was the youngest of Cree's 3 enforcers, and the one that everyone who knew Redemption had identified as the least predictable. He was perhaps 25, with a narrow face and restless eyes, and he had the specific quality of someone who has been given authority without the temperament to wield it responsibly. He was also, Warren had established over 11 months, the person Cree sent when he wanted something done that the other 2 would hesitate to do. Dobbs found Warren on the evening of the second day, at the stable where he worked. He came in through the back and stood in the doorway with his thumbs in his gun belt, and the particular performance of casualness that people adopt when they are trying to conceal that they are frightened of the person they are confronting. He told Warren that Mr. Cree had a message for him. The message was that Mr. Cree was aware of Warren's interest in the recent visitor to town, and that Mr. Cree thought it would be a shame if the farrier operation that Warren had built here were to become untenable due to circumstances beyond his control. Warren listened to this with the expression he had developed over a decade and a half of being in situations where the wrong response had permanent consequences. Then he told Dobbs in a pleasant and completely serious voice that he appreciated the message and would give it all the consideration it deserved. Dobbs left. Warren sent another note to Gertrude. It said, "Cree knows we have a connection. You need to be careful tonight. Is there someone in the hotel you trust to stay near?" Her response said, "I trust myself, but I appreciate the concern. Is there someone Cree trusts who might be persuaded otherwise?" He stared at that last line for a while. Then he wrote back, "Dobbs is frightened of something. I don't know what yet. I'll find out." Finding out what Dobbs was frightened of took most of the following day and involved a conversation with the stable hand who worked alongside Warren, a young man named Felix who had grown up in Redemption and had the specific advantage of people tending not to notice him, which meant he noticed everything. Felix told Warren that Dobbs had a sister in San Antonio who was currently being supported by money Dobbs sent her each month, and that the source of that money was something Dobbs was extremely careful about, for the fairly obvious reason that if his sister knew where it came from, she would send it back. Warren thought about this for approximately 3 minutes and then went to find Dobbs. He found him at the far end of the saloon, sitting alone with a beer, in the late afternoon before the evening crowd arrived. He sat down across from him without invitation and said, with the directness that he had decided was the only useful approach, that he understood Dobbs was in a position he had not chosen entirely of his own free will, and that there might be a way out of it that did not involve his sister's circumstances becoming public knowledge. Dobbs went very still. Warren said that what he needed from Dobbs was one thing: to not interfere in what was coming, and to be in a position to confirm to the federal marshal, who would be arriving in Redemption in approximately 48 hours, that Cree had, on specific occasions, directed his employees to take specific actions regarding specific properties. He did not need Dobbs to testify formally necessarily. He needed him to be available. Dobbs said nothing for a long time. Then he said in a voice stripped of its usual performance, "Cree knows about the ledger." Warren felt the floor of the situation shift slightly. When did he find out? Last night. He went to the safe to retrieve it for something and found it gone. He doesn't know who took it. He suspects you and the woman. He sent Breck to Austin this morning to find the lawyer. Warren said, "How long before Breck gets to Austin?" "He took the morning stage. It connects at the junction. He'll be in Austin by tomorrow evening." Warren thought for 2 seconds, then excused himself with a word of thanks and walked, at his ordinary pace and with his ordinary expression, out of the saloon and to the telegraph office. He sent 2 telegrams. The first was to the Austin lawyer, warning him that a man named Breck was coming, and advising him to remove anything related to the Cree case from his office and his person until the federal presence arrived in Redemption. The second was to Marshal Briggs, who he asked to advance his timeline if at all possible. Then he went to find Gertrude. He found her at the Cottonwood spot, which had become, over the past 10 days, their default meeting place in the way that certain locations accrue significance through repeated use in conversation. She listened to everything he told her without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The ledger is already on its way to San Antonio. I sent it with the mail rider this morning in a package addressed to Marshal Briggs." He stared at her. She said, "I was careful. I didn't use my name or yours. I used a description of the contents that would be recognizable to Briggs if he received it, but not to anyone else. The original pages are intact and I kept the transcriptions." She paused. "I made the decision without consulting you, which I should have. I'm sorry for that, but I thought we had run out of the kind of time that allows for consultation." He was quiet for a moment that she clearly found uncomfortable because she added, "If that was the wrong call, tell me." He said, "It was exactly the right call," and saw something in her face ease slightly, which he found he wanted to see again. He said, "Cree is going to know within a day or 2 that it's gone. Once the marshal arrives and the federal jurisdiction is established, Cree won't be able to operate in the county the way he has been. The evidence in that ledger will unravel everything," she said. "And my father's land," he said. "Federal courts can overturn fraudulent deed registrations. With the ledger as evidence and Elkins's testimony, your claim is airtight. You'll get it back." She was quiet again, and this time it was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of someone who has been holding something tightly for a long time and is beginning, cautiously, to relax their grip. She said, "I didn't come here expecting to find anyone who was already fighting the same fight." He said, "Neither did I." She looked at the horizon, which was doing its sunset performance again. "When this is over, what do you do next?" He said, "I haven't thought about it that much. I've been thinking about this for so long that the next part hasn't had much room to develop." She said, "I've been teaching school in Austin. I expect I'll go back to that or something similar. The land will need managing once it's restored, but I can do that from Austin if I find a good tenant operation." He said, "Or you could manage it directly." She said, "Alone." There was a pause. He said, "That wasn't I didn't mean," and stopped. She looked at him, and there was something in the air between them that had been building for 10 days, and that both of them had been carefully not acknowledging, and that was now present in a way that was difficult to address indirectly. She said, "What did you mean?" He said, with the specific courage of someone who has decided that the risk of clarity is less than the risk of ambiguity. "I meant that you shouldn't have to manage anything alone. And I meant that I would like there to be a conversation eventually about whether that is a thing you would consider." He paused. "I am doing this very badly." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You're doing it better than you think." He said, "Is that a yes to the conversation?" She said, "It is a yes to the conversation. It is also a statement that the conversation has to happen after the current situation is resolved, because I am not capable of having two important things happening simultaneously without compromising both of them. He said, "That is a completely reasonable position." She said, "Good," and stood up and went back to town. Marshal Briggs arrived in Redemption 32 hours later, faster than the original plan, because Warren's telegram had apparently communicated sufficient urgency. He came with 2 deputies and a federal warrant for the arrest of Harlan Cree on charges that began with mail fraud and land theft and extended, as they reviewed the ledger, into territory considerably more serious. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, efficiently and without the violence that such proceedings in Redemption might otherwise have invited, largely because Briggs was experienced and because Dobbs, true to his implicit arrangement with Warren, had ensured that Breck and German Carl were in a position of reduced readiness at the relevant moment. The details of how he managed this were not shared and were not asked for. Cree was taken out of his office above the bank in the full view of Main Street, which had the particular quality of a town watching something they had not dared to believe was possible. People came to their doorways. The hardware store owner crossed his arms in the doorway and watched with an expression of long vindication. The woman from the dry goods store gripped the counter inside her shop and let out a breath she had been holding for what looked like years. Purvis Dunmore, the county clerk, surrendered to a federal officer that same afternoon. He was, in the end, more relieved than frightened, which was the look of a man who had been complicit in something he had never been comfortable with and was finally experiencing the specific mercy of being caught. Warren was standing in front of the stable when they brought Cree out. He watched the marshal's party cross the street toward the temporary federal presence that had been established at the sheriff's office, Sheriff Tuttle having stepped aside with minimal protest and obvious relief, and he felt something release in his chest that had been tight for so long he had almost forgotten what it felt like without it. He thought about Tom Graves, who had been a good man and who had died because of Cree's greed, and he thought about 1,200 acres of hill country and a woman who had traveled 800 miles alone to do what was right, and he felt the specific quality of something being finished in a way that allowed the next thing to begin. He found Gertrude at the hotel that evening. She was in the dining room, sitting at the corner table, their table, he thought, and then caught himself thinking it and did not stop, and she was writing a letter. He did not interrupt her until she had finished and set down her pen, and then he sat across from her. She said, "It's done." He said, "It's done." She said, "The federal order regarding the fraudulent deeds will be processed within the week. Briggs told me personally." He said, "I know. He told me the same." He paused. "The land is coming home." She looked at him, and her eyes, for the first time since he had met her, had something in them that was not calculation or determination or careful control, but something simpler and more personal and more vulnerable, and it was, he thought, the most genuine thing he had ever seen. She said, "I need to say something." He said, "All right," she said. "I came here alone because I am accustomed to being alone and because I did not expect to find I did not expect." She stopped, started again. "I am not a person who makes important decisions impulsively, about anything. I don't think I'm being impulsive when I say that you are the person I trust most in the world right now, which is remarkable considering that 10 days ago I had never met you, and that whatever the conversation is that we agreed to have, I would like to have it soon." He said, "How soon?" She said, "Now would be acceptable." He said, "All right." And then, because he was not a man who was comfortable with elaborate declarations, but was a man who was comfortable with direct truth, he said, "I have been alone for a long time by choice, because I found it safer than the alternative, and I stopped expecting to meet someone who made me want to choose differently. You have in 10 days completely reversed that preference, and I would like to spend considerably more than 10 days in your company, if you'll permit it." She said, "Permit it." Warren, I came here to reclaim my father's land and restore some basic justice to 23 families, and I am leaving here having done both of those things and also having found something I didn't know I was looking for." She paused. "Yes, I'll permit it." He laughed, and she laughed, and it was the first time they had both laughed at the same thing at the same moment, and it had the quality of something becoming real. They talked for 3 hours that evening, over dinner and coffee and then more coffee, and they talked about things that were not the operation or the ledger or Harlan Cree. They talked about where they had come from, about what they had wanted when they were younger and what had happened to those plans, about the specific quality of grief for a parent, and the way it sits with you not as a sharp thing, but as an absence, always at approximately the same place in the peripheral vision. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about a father who had been a blacksmith, and a mother who had read everything she could get her hands on and taught her children to do the same. He told her about coming west at 19, and about the years of itinerant work and learning, and the things those years had cost him, and what he thought they had been worth. She told him about growing up on the Hill Country Ranch, about the particular quality of those early mornings when the land was still, and the light came sideways through the cedar scrub, about her father teaching her to ride before she could read, about a mother she remembered in fragments, the smell of her hands, the sound of her singing, the peach trees she had planted that were still bearing fruit every summer, about teaching school in Austin and finding unexpected satisfaction in the work and also unexpected limitations. He said, "What limitations?" she said. "The assumption that teaching was a holding pattern, something women did until they had a husband and a household to manage." She paused. "I liked teaching. I was good at it. I wanted to be good at it without it being a consolation prize." He said, "It wasn't." She looked at him. He said, "Whatever else you were managing in Austin, you were good at something important and you knew it. That's not a consolation. That's just true." She said, "You're going to be somewhat challenging to argue with, I think." He said, "Good. I need someone who will try." She returned to Austin 2 weeks later, after the federal proceedings had been formally initiated, and after she had walked the 1,200 acres with a federal surveyor, and confirmed the boundaries and begun the process of having the legitimate deed restored in her name. Walking those acres was the part she had not let herself anticipate too much, because anticipating it too fully would have required a kind of hope that she had been rationing carefully. The land was exactly as her father had described it, and as she had known it as a child, the creek running clear in its stone bed, the cedar and oak along the ridge line, the open grazing land to the south, the remains of the peach orchard her mother had planted, 8 trees still standing and showing the end-of-summer leaves. She stood there for a long time in the late afternoon quiet, and Warren stood a few feet away and did not say anything, because he understood without needing to be told that this was a private reckoning, and that the best thing he could do was simply be present for it. She did not cry, which was consistent. But when she finally turned away from the orchard and walked back toward where they had left the horses, she reached out as she passed him and briefly gripped his hand, and he held it until they reached the horses, and then a little bit after. In Austin, things moved with the momentum that federal action gives to processes that have been stalled for years. The lawyer who had told Gertrude there was nothing to be done was substantially more energetic when the federal warrant provided the opening he had claimed was unavailable. The deed was restored within 3 months. Elkins provided his testimony, which added considerable texture to the case against Cree, and which Gertrude suspected had been as much a relief for Elkins as a legal formality. Warren stayed in redemption through the federal proceedings, which required his testimony and his continued access to the documentation he had been compiling. He wrote her letters during this period, long letters, written in the same direct voice in which he spoke, that covered the progress of the case and also the things he was noticing about the town as it adjusted to the removal of Cree's influence, which was doing so in the tentative blinking way that places adjust when a long shadow is lifted. She wrote back. Her letters were precise and warm and occasionally very funny, in the dry way that her humor manifested, and reading them had the specific quality of having a conversation with someone whose company you are already missing. He came to Austin in November, on the occasion of a federal court hearing that required his appearance, and she met him at the stage, and they had dinner at a restaurant that was considerably more formal than the hotel dining room in Redemption. And it was different in ways that were also the same, and the conversation that had begun at a corner table in a frontier hotel continued as though no time had passed. He said over the remains of the dinner, "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said. "I've been thinking about the same thing." He said, "The land needs to be managed properly. The ranch operation needs to be rebuilt. That's a significant project for one person." She said, "It is." He said, "I'm a competent horse trader and farrier with 11 months of experience investigating complex fraud operations and a reasonable familiarity with the Texas Hill Country. I am also," he stopped. Then he said, with the courage that she had come to recognize as his specific quality of directness when something mattered, "I am also completely in love with you, which I have been for some time, and which I would like to have out in the open rather than operating as a premise we're politely not stating." She looked at him. He said, "I would like to ask you to marry me if you are open to the idea. I am asking in advance of a formal proposal which I would like to do properly, because I want to know first that the idea is not unwelcome before I commit to the specific form." She said, "It is not unwelcome." He said, "Good." She said, "Ask me properly." He said, "Right now." She said, "Yes. Right now." He put down his fork and he looked at her across the table, and he said without the hedging and qualification that had preceded it, because that had been the preamble and this was the real thing, "Gertrude Alden, I would like to spend the rest of my life being the person you argue with, and the person you come home to, and the person who stands a few feet away when you need a minute and comes close when you don't. Will you marry me?" She was quiet for one breath. Then she said, "Yes, Warren Whitfield, I will." They were married in January of 1883, in a small ceremony at the Austin courthouse that was attended by her lawyer, the newspaper editor Warren had been corresponding with, the woman from the dry goods store in Redemption who had become something approaching a friend during Gertrude's time there, and Felix the stable hand, who had cleaned up remarkably well and who cried in the cheerful, uncomplicated way of someone who is very happy for the people involved. Dutch Pierce sent a wedding gift from Redemption, which was a bottle of very good whiskey with a note that said, in characteristically economical style, "Hell of a thing you two did. Congratulations." They went back to the Hill Country Ranch in February. The work of rebuilding was substantial and it was real, and it was the most satisfying thing that either of them had done, which surprised neither of them. Gertrude managed the accounts and the legal structure of the operation with the same meticulous precision she applied to everything, and Warren rebuilt the stock operation from the ground up, starting with 6 horses and expanding methodically. They worked alongside each other in the specific way that two people who are both capable and different in their capabilities work together, which is not always easy and is rarely without friction, and is, in the end, one of the more reliable forms of partnership. They had disagreements about the pace of the cattle operation, which he wanted to accelerate and she wanted to approach conservatively until the debt from the rebuilding was cleared. About the question of a hired hand, which he thought they needed sooner and she thought they needed to wait on. About small things and large things in the ordinary ratio of married life. The disagreements were always, every single time, resolved. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes she was right. Occasionally they were both wrong and found something better in the territory between their positions. He had been correct that she was someone worth arguing with, and she had been correct that he was challenging to argue with, and both of them were right that these were qualities worth having in each other. The peach trees flowered in March, which neither of them had expected. The orchard had looked bare when they arrived, battered by the dry season, and Gertrude had been quietly preparing herself for the possibility that the trees had not survived. But the March warmth brought blossoms in the way that things sometimes recover when you give them enough room and enough time, and she walked out one morning and stood among the flowering trees in the early light, and Warren came out behind her with coffee and put one cup in her hand and said nothing, because nothing was needed. Their first child was born in December of 1883, a boy they named Daniel, after her father's middle name, which had also been the name her father called himself when he was among friends. He was healthy and loud, and arrived with the kind of decisive energy that suggested he had opinions and intended to express them, which Gertrude found entirely familiar. Warren held him for the first time with the careful astonishment of a man encountering something for which no amount of preparation is actually sufficient, and looked at Gertrude over the top of the baby's head with an expression so open and unguarded that she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the particular courage of his heart was the thing she loved most about him. She said, "Hello, Daniel," in that low, soft voice, and the baby stopped crying and looked at her with the complete, concentrated attention of someone hearing a sound they recognize from a long way back. The trial of Harlan Cree concluded in the spring of 1884 in a federal court in San Antonio. He was convicted on 19 counts of fraud, forgery, and land theft, and was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge's summary of the evidence noted that the case represented one of the most systematic patterns of property fraud in the history of Texas, and that its exposure had been the result of an exceptional combination of private determination and federal cooperation. Gertrude and Warren attended the sentencing. They sat in the gallery with Elkins, who had provided testimony that was both brave and comprehensive, and with 3 of the other affected families who had come from various parts of the county to see the conclusion. Purvis Dunmore had entered a plea arrangement and had been sentenced to 2 years, with significant conditions related to his future conduct in any official capacity, which most people regarded as appropriate given the degree to which his situation had been the result of family pressure as much as genuine corruption. When the gavel came down and the sentence was announced, the gallery was quiet for a moment. Then the woman sitting 2 rows behind them began to cry, not with grief but with the specific helpless relief of justice that arrives after being almost given up on, and around her, quietly, several other people did the same. Gertrude did not cry. But she reached sideways and found Warren's hand and held it, and he held it back, and that was enough. They drove back to the ranch from San Antonio over 2 days, stopping overnight at a roadside inn that was considerably less comfortable than either of them would have preferred. And Daniel, who was 4 months old, and at the stage of his development where he found the motion of a wagon deeply soothing and its absence deeply objectionable, slept for most of the journey and spent the nights making himself energetically known. Warren drove and Gertrude sat beside him with Daniel when he was awake, and the Texas hill country rolled past them in its March best wildflowers beginning in the draws, the sky very large and very blue, the kind of day that makes you feel, even if you are tired and a little road-worn, that the world is fundamentally generous. She said, "It really is over." He said, "It is." She said, "I keep expecting to find another thing." He said, "That's the habit of someone who's been fighting for a long time. It takes a while to remember that you don't have to." She said, "Have you remembered?" He considered this genuinely, which was the way he considered things. Mostly. Some days better than others. He paused. "You help," she said. "Good, that's what I'm here for," he said, "among other things." She said, "Among other things." The years that followed had the quality of real life, which is to say that they were not without difficulty. There were drought years and lean years, and the particular hardships of building something from the ground up in a part of the world that did not make any of it easy. but they had the essential quality of being lived alongside someone whose presence made the difficult parts navigable and the good parts genuinely good. Their second child, a girl they named Clara, was born in the spring of 1886. She arrived with her mother's eyes and her father's laugh, and an extremely firm opinion about the timing of meals that both parents found both exhausting and recognizable. She and Daniel were close in the way that siblings close in age can be when the household is a warm one contentiously, loyally, constantly. The ranch grew. Warren expanded the horse operation into something with a real reputation. He had a gift for it that went beyond the technical skill, something in his patience with animals and his ability to read what they needed, and word spread in the county and then beyond it. Gertrude returned to teaching in a form. She began holding a weekly class at the ranch for the children of neighboring families whose access to the town school in Redemption was limited by distance, and what started as 4 students became 12, and then became the nucleus of a small community school that was eventually formalized with county support. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, and it had never been a consolation prize. The peach orchard was fully restored by the summer of 1885, all 8 trees bearing heavily. They put up the preserves in the late August heat, the kitchen smelling of sugar and fruit, and Gertrude stood at the stove in the morning light and thought about her mother, who had planted those trees and never saw this kitchen, and about her father, who had built the land and never saw it restored, and about the particular relationship between loss and continuation that she had been working out her understanding of ever since she was 8 years old and her world had rearranged itself without warning. Warren came in from the morning chores and saw her face and said, without asking what she was thinking, "They'd be very pleased." She said, "I know," he said, "your father especially. He'd find this exactly right." She turned and looked at him and thought, not for the first time, that this was the specific grace of being known by someone, the way they can say the true thing without needing to be told what the true thing is. She said, "He would have liked you enormously." He said, "I would have liked him right back," and took a jar of peach preserves from the shelf and opened it and ate a spoonful standing at the counter, and she made a noise of protest, and he handed her the jar and she took a spoonful too, and it was exactly as good as she had hoped. In the fall of 1887, they were sitting on the porch in the evening, Daniel 4 years old and finally in bed, after a demonstration of the physical stamina of small children that both parents had found impressive and exhausting, Clara 18 months and asleep on Warren's shoulder in the specific boneless way that toddlers sleep. And the stars were doing their enormous Texas performance above the cedar line, and Warren said, "Do you know what I think about?" She said, "Often. But specifically right now," he said, "the silver spur, the night you walked in." She said, "What about it?" He said, "I was standing at that bar thinking about nothing much except that I had been in that town for over a year and I still didn't have what I needed and it was possible I never would. And then you came through that door." She said, he said, "And I thought, even before everything that happened, before the plan and the ledger and all of it, I thought, whoever she is, she's the most capable person in this room. And that room had 40 people in it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I came there to find you. I had one name and I came to find the person attached to it, and I found someone considerably more than a useful ally." He said, "Same, considerably more." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the one not occupied by the sleeping Clara, and they sat in the evening with the land around them, the creek audible in the distance, the stars very bright and very numerous above the ridge line. And Warren thought, with the specific clarity of someone who has had occasion to know the difference, that this was what it felt like when the thing you had been afraid to hope for turned out to be not only real but better than the hope. He said, "You know, the entire town talked about that night for months." She said, "What night?" He said, "The night in the Silver Spur. Everyone who was there told someone, and everyone who wasn't wished they had been. Dutch told me that 3 different men claimed to have been standing right next to you when it happened." She said, "None of them were." He said, "I know. I was the one standing closest, and even I was across the bar." He paused. Dutch said he'd never seen the place go that quiet, said you arrived speaking softly and left every man in the saloon completely silent. She thought about this. "Is that how people told it?" he said. "That's how it happened." She said, "I was terrified, that night." He said, "I know," she said. "I had 4 words and a bluff and a great deal of hope that neither would be tested further." He said, "They didn't need to be." "Because you said them like you meant them," she said. "I did mean them. I simply didn't have the evidence yet." He said, "Details." She laughed, and he felt it against his shoulder, and Clara stirred slightly and resettled without waking, and the evening continued in its generous way around them. A 3rd child came in the spring of 1889, another boy, born in the peach blossom season and named for Warren's father James, called Jamie almost immediately by Daniel, who was 6 and had opinions about names, and by Clara, who was 3 and had opinions about everything. Jamie arrived with red hair that neither of his parents could account for, which became a source of extended speculation, and which Dutch Pierce, on a visit to the ranch the following Christmas, declared the most interesting development he had heard of in years and proposed a toast to. Dutch had retired from the Silver Spur the previous year, sold it to a young couple who had come up from San Antonio with the intention of running a respectable establishment, and had purchased a small plot of land north of Redemption where he was growing vegetables with, by his own accounting, moderate success and great personal satisfaction. He visited the ranch twice a year after that, and was regarded by the children as a person of enormous importance and interesting stories. He and Warren played cards on these visits with the particular focused enjoyment of 2 men who had been in adjacent positions during a significant thing, and had emerged with considerable mutual respect. Redemption itself changed over the years. With Cree gone and the federal presence that followed the trial having clarified the county's legal landscape considerably, the town settled into a more ordinary kind of governance, not perfect, because no human arrangement is, but functional in the ways that mattered. The families whose land had been stolen through the fraud scheme were, for the most part, restored to their holdings, which was a legal process that was complicated and slow, but which eventually, in the majority of cases, concluded correctly. The county school grew, and then had to add a 2nd room, and then the community successfully petitioned the county for a properly staffed school, which arrived with 2 teachers and a small but serviceable building on the western edge of town. Gertrude was consulted in the establishment of its curriculum, because her informal school on the ranch had by that point educated 32 children in 5 years, and had a reputation for producing students who could do arithmetic, had read significant literature, and were not intimidated by either. The Silver Spur remained. Under the new management, it was somewhat less interesting than it had been under Dutch, but also somewhat less likely to have federal complications, which was broadly regarded as a reasonable trade. Warren's horse operation became, by the early 1890s, genuinely significant, not the largest in Texas, not by a considerable margin, but reputable in the specific way that matters in horse trading, which is that when people asked about it they were told by experienced sources that the animals were well bred, well handled, and honestly sold. He had 4 hands working for him by then, and a partnership with a breeder in San Antonio, and the satisfaction of a man who is doing the thing he is genuinely good at in a place that has become genuinely home. He still had the quality of paying attention to everything simultaneously without appearing to focus on any one thing, which Gertrude had identified the night they met, and which had not diminished with the years. If anything, it had deepened into something that their children would describe, when they were older, as the feeling that their father always knew what was happening in a room without having to look. Daniel grew up with his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was an excellent combination in a young man. Clara grew up with both parents' intelligence and a social ease that was entirely her own. Jamie grew up red-haired and intensely curious about every mechanical thing he encountered, which Warren attributed to his grandmother's influence at a genetic remove, and which nobody could fully explain but everyone eventually accepted as simply Jamie. In the summer of 1892, when Daniel was 9 and Clara 7 and Jamie 3, Gertrude walked out to the orchard in the early morning before the household was fully awake, which was a practice she had maintained since the first spring on the land, and she stood among the peach trees with the fruit just beginning to color and the early light coming sideways through the leaves. And she thought about everything that had led to this moment with the full accounting of someone who no longer needed to ration their capacity for gratitude. She thought about her father's hard hands and patient voice. She thought about the Austin lawyer and his damp hands and his polite certainty that nothing could be done. She thought about a stage arriving in Redemption in the August heat, and a hotel room with a searched trunk, and 4 words said softly into a noisy saloon that had gone completely, utterly still. She thought about a man at the end of a bar with a glass of rye he had been nursing for an hour, who had watched everything with the eyes of someone paying attention, and who had come to find her afterward with the courage of someone who has decided that the risk of clarity is less than the risk of ambiguity. She heard the screen door of the house open and footsteps on the porch, and then on the path through the kitchen garden, and then Warren was standing beside her among the peach trees with 2 cups of coffee, handing her one, looking at the fruit with the assessing expression of a man who has learned enough about orchards to have opinions. She said, "Good year for them." He said, "Better than last year." She said, "Warren." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want you to know something." He turned to look at her. The morning light was very clear, and the air smelled of fruit and warm earth and the distant creek, and she looked at him in the direct way that had not changed in 10 years. Still that same quality of being fully seen and being certain in return, but layered now with a decade of shared life and shared difficulty, and the particular texture that only actual time together can create. She said, "I want you to know that when I got on that stage to Redemption, I had a list of what I needed, and it was a very clear and practical list, and you were on it as a means to an end, and I was fully prepared for that to be true and to be sufficient, and I am glad with my entire heart that it turned out to be completely and entirely insufficient." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he smiled, which was the smile that she had learned to distinguish from his other smiles, the polite one, the amused one, the one he used when the children were being impossible and he was trying not to laugh, and that was just straightforwardly happy, unguarded and real. He said, "Me too." She said, "Good," and drank her coffee in the morning light among her mother's peach trees on her father's land. And the day opened around them in the particular way of days that are not remarkable and are therefore exactly right, and the life that had been built on the foundation of 4 quiet words spoken in a noisy saloon continued in all its ordinary and extraordinary particulars, solid and warm and entirely, completely theirs.